In the quiet town of Slaughter, Louisiana, Sheila and Clay Fletcher were seen as model citizens. But behind their tidy home lay a horrifying secret. Their daughter, Lacy, had spent years wasting away on a filthy couch, unseen by the world. When the truth emerged, it shocked the nation to its core. Nestled in East Feliciana Parish, the small town of Slaughter, Louisiana, was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names. Life moved slowly here, with neighbors exchanging friendly waves and weekend gatherings filling the air with laughter. Among the town's familiar faces were Sheila and Clay Fletcher, longtime residents known for their community involvement. Sheila served as an alderwoman, and Clay was active in local organizations. To those who knew them, the Fletchers seemed like an ordinary, respectable family. Their only child, Lacey Ellen Fletcher, was rarely seen around town in recent years, but few questioned it. As children grow up, they often drift from small-town life, and most assumed Lacy had simply chosen a quieter path. The Fletchers' brick home on Tom Drive sat quietly at the end of a cul-de-sac, its neat appearance betraying none of the horrors that lay inside. For years, no one suspected that behind the closed doors of the Fletcher home, a tragedy was unfolding. It wasn't until a cold January morning in 2022 that the veil of normalcy was ripped away, revealing a nightmare that would shock not just Slaughter, but the entire nation. The quiet town, once known for its peaceful streets and friendly faces, would soon become synonymous with one of the most disturbing cases of neglect in recent memory. Lacey Ellen Fletcher was born in 1985, the only child of Sheila and Clay Fletcher. In her early years, she was described as a bright, cheerful girl who loved playing outside and spending time with neighborhood friends. She attended Brownsville Baptist Academy, where she participated in various school activities and was a member of the volleyball team. Her teachers and peers remembered her as polite, intelligent, and engaged in both her studies and social life. Around the age of 10, Lacy was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and social anxiety, conditions that began to shape her adolescence. While her early childhood had been filled with laughter and companionship, these diagnoses marked a shift. Though her parents reportedly sought professional help, including therapy and medical consultations, Lacy's social interactions became increasingly limited. She withdrew from group activities and found it difficult to maintain the friendships she had once cherished. By the time she reached her teenage years, Lacy's presence in public grew scarce. She transitioned to homeschooling, and neighbors noticed her absence from community events. Despite her withdrawal, those who knew her in her earlier years struggled to reconcile the lively, curious child they remembered with the quiet, isolated figure she was becoming. Yet few pressed the issue, trusting that her parents were managing her care. Behind the walls of the Fletcher home, however, Lacy's world was shrinking more than anyone could have imagined. For a time, neighbors occasionally asked about her, but Sheila and Clay Fletcher assured them that Lacy was fine, preferring the privacy and comfort of home due to her struggles with social anxiety. The Fletchers themselves began to withdraw from social life, their once frequent participation in local events tapering off. The family's house on Tom Drive appeared well kept from the outside, offering no clues to the life unfolding within. To the casual observer, there was nothing unusual about a young adult choosing a quieter life at home, and in a small town like Slaughter, people were inclined to respect personal boundaries. Years passed, and Lacy became a distant memory to most in the community. Friends from her childhood moved on with their lives, assuming Lacy had done the same in her own way. No one thought to question her absence further. After all, her parents were prominent, seemingly responsible members of the town. Inside the Fletcher home, however, Lacy's existence had become one of profound isolation. She was confined to a single room, her world reduced to the worn-out couch where she remained for years. With no visitors and no outside intervention, the conditions of her life and her deteriorating health remained hidden from everyone. The once vibrant girl who had played volleyball and laughed with friends was now a ghost in her own home, unseen and unheard by the community that had quietly forgotten her. On the morning of January 3rd, 2022, Sheila Fletcher made a call to 911 that would uncover a nightmare hidden in plain sight. Her voice was calm as she reported that her daughter, Lacy, was unresponsive. There was no urgency, no sign of panic, just a simple request for assistance. When emergency responders arrived at the Fletcher home on Tom Drive, nothing on the exterior hinted at the horror awaiting inside. The front door opened to a wave of stifling, putrid air. As paramedics stepped inside, they were struck by the overwhelming odor of decay mixed with human waste. Navigating through the house, they found Lacy in the living room, seated on a sunken couch. What they saw defied belief. Lacy's body was partially fused to the sofa, her skin adhering to the fabric after years of immobility. She sat in a reclined position, covered in feces and sores, her body emaciated to just 96 pounds. Open ulcers marred her skin, some so deep that bone was visible. Her lower body was buried in a hole in the couch, surrounded by soiled towels and blankets. Insects swarmed around her, and the air was thick with the smell of rot. The scene suggested that Lacy had been in the same position for years. She was covered in urine and feces, with no signs of recent hygiene or medical care. Despite the horrific state of her body, the house itself was otherwise tidy, creating a stark contrast that baffled first responders. Lacy was declared dead at the scene. Authorities noted the shocking state of neglect and immediately contacted the East Feliciana Parish Coroner's Office. It was clear that this was not a sudden death, but the result of prolonged suffering and abandonment. As investigators began documenting the scene, the Fletchers provided little explanation. They claimed that Lacy had refused to leave the couch or seek medical help due to her anxiety, but the severity of her condition suggested far more than simple reluctance. The discovery sent shockwaves through the small town of Slaughter, and soon the entire nation would learn the name Lacey Ellen Fletcher, a symbol of unimaginable neglect hidden behind a facade of normalcy. The autopsy of Lacey Ellen Fletcher revealed a level of suffering and neglect that stunned even seasoned professionals. Conducted by Dr. Ewell Bickham III, the East Feliciana Parish Coroner, the report listed her cause of death as acute medical neglect, compounded by malnutrition, untreated infections, and severe bed sores. The findings painted a gruesome picture of a young woman who had endured years of silent agony. At the time of her death, Lacy weighed just 96 pounds. Her body was covered in open ulcers, some of which had penetrated deep into her flesh, exposing bone. These sores, known as pressure ulcers or bed sores, are common in individuals who remain immobile for extended periods without proper care. The ulcers on Lacy's body indicated she had been in the same position for years, sitting in her own waste without relief. One of the most disturbing details was that Lacy's body was partially fused to the couch where she had died. Skin and tissue had become bonded to the upholstery, and the surrounding area was soaked with bodily fluids and feces. The autopsy revealed that Lacy had developed sepsis, a life-threatening condition caused by a severe infection entering the bloodstream. Sepsis alone could have led to her death, but it was compounded by starvation and dehydration. The report also noted that Lacy suffered from locked-in syndrome, a condition where a person is conscious but unable to move or communicate due to paralysis. This suggested that Lacy had been mentally aware of her suffering but physically incapable of seeking help or relief. However, there were no signs that she had received any medical attention in the years leading up to her death. Dr. Bickham described the case as one of the worst he had ever encountered. The level of neglect was so profound that it shocked even those accustomed to tragic cases. He stated that Lacy's death was not an accident or the result of natural causes, but the consequence of prolonged, deliberate neglect. The autopsy findings left no doubt. Lacey Ellen Fletcher had died slowly and painfully, trapped in a living nightmare, while those responsible for her care did nothing to intervene. Following the autopsy, East Feliciana Parish authorities launched an immediate investigation into the circumstances surrounding Lacey Fletcher's death. The horrific details from the crime scene and medical report raised serious questions about how such neglect could occur unnoticed for so long. Sheriff Jeff Travis, leading the investigation, described the case as deeply disturbing, emphasizing that it was unlike anything his department had ever encountered. Detectives began by interviewing Sheila and Clay Fletcher. The couple maintained that Lacey's mental health struggles, particularly her severe social anxiety and autism spectrum disorder, were at the root of her condition. They claimed that Lacey had chosen to isolate herself and refused any form of medical treatment. Sheila insisted that they respected their daughter's wishes, suggesting that they were not neglectful, but honoring Lacey's autonomy. However, investigators found these explanations difficult to reconcile with the overwhelming evidence of prolonged suffering and complete lack of basic care. Neighbors were also questioned, many expressing disbelief and horror as details emerged. Some admitted they hadn't seen Lacey in over a decade, but had assumed she was living a private life due to her anxiety. Few had any idea that she was even still in the home. Sheila and Clay's outward appearances gave no indication of trouble. They were regarded as polite, involved citizens. This revelation shocked those who had considered them upstanding members of the community. Authorities scoured the Fletcher home for additional evidence, examining Lacey's living conditions and the family's communication history. There were no signs of recent medical consultations, prescriptions, or attempts to seek professional help. Despite Sheila's position as an alderwoman and the couple's community involvement, no one had ever been invited inside their home, and no welfare checks had been conducted. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became that Lacey's death wasn't a tragic accident, but the result of years of abandonment. The case quickly shifted from a medical inquiry to a criminal investigation, setting the stage for what would become a national headline. On May 2, 2022, 4 months after Lacey Fletcher's death, a grand jury convened in East Feliciana Parish returned a swift indictment. Sheila and Clay Fletcher were charged with second-degree murder, a charge that carries a mandatory life sentence without the possibility of parole in Louisiana. The indictment was based on overwhelming evidence of prolonged neglect and the gruesome conditions under which Lacey died. Sheriff Jeff Travis confirmed the arrests later that day. Sheila and Clay Fletcher were taken into custody without incident and booked into the East Feliciana Parish Jail. Their bond was set at $300,000 each. Shortly after their booking, both posted bond and were released, pending trial. Their release only intensified the community's outrage, as many felt justice was being delayed for Lacey. At the bond hearing, prosecutors laid out the severity of the case, emphasizing that Lacey's death was not only preventable, but the result of willful and deliberate neglect. They argued that the Fletchers had multiple opportunities to seek medical intervention, but instead allowed their daughter to waste away in inhumane conditions. Photos from the scene and details from the autopsy were presented as evidence of the cruelty Lacey endured. The defense, however, painted a different picture. The Fletchers' attorney claimed that Lacey was mentally competent and had the right to refuse care. They argued that her autism and social anxiety contributed to her reclusive behavior and that her parents, while perhaps misguided, did not intentionally harm her. The defense also suggested that the Fletchers were overwhelmed and lacked the resources to properly care for their daughter, despite their outward appearance of stability. The case quickly gained national attention. Media outlets across the country reported on the horrific details, and public outrage grew. Many questioned how such extreme neglect could go unnoticed in a small town where everyone knew each other. The Fletchers, once seen as upstanding citizens, were now the faces of a shocking and unforgivable crime. As the legal proceedings began, the town of Slaughter grappled with the harsh reality that one of their own had endured unimaginable suffering, hidden in plain sight. The trial of Sheila and Clay Fletcher was set to be one of the most closely watched cases in Louisiana's recent history. However, legal proceedings were delayed multiple times due to pretrial motions and the complexity of the case. Prosecutors were determined to prove that Lacey Fletcher's death was the direct result of her parents' willful neglect, while the defense maintained that mental health issues and personal choice played a significant role in her tragic end. During pretrial hearings, prosecutors presented harrowing evidence, including autopsy photos, forensic reports, and testimonies from first responders who described the horrifying conditions in which Lacy was found. The prosecution argued that Lacy had been entirely dependent on her parents for care, and that their failure to provide basic necessities like food, hygiene, and medical attention amounted to murder. They emphasized that Lacy's mental health struggles did not absolve the Fletchers of their legal and moral responsibilities as caregivers. The defense focused on Lacy's autonomy, insisting that she had refused to leave the couch or accept medical care. They portrayed the Fletchers as loving parents who were overwhelmed by their daughter's deteriorating mental health. The defense also highlighted the lack of intervention from outside agencies, suggesting that if signs of neglect had been evident, others might have stepped in. However, the prosecution countered that the conditions inside the Fletcher home were so extreme that no reasonable person could believe this was simply a matter of respecting a daughter's wishes. After months of legal wrangling, the trial finally commenced. Witnesses included medical experts, law enforcement officials, and neighbors. The jury listened to graphic descriptions of Lacy's condition, the details of her autopsy, and the statements from paramedics who first arrived at the scene. The prosecution argued that the evidence left no room for doubt. Lacey Fletcher had died in slow agony, and her parents had done nothing to stop it. The jury deliberated for only a short time before returning a guilty verdict for both Sheila and Clay Fletcher on the charge of second-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read, the weight of the case settling over everyone present. The judge sentenced both to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the mandatory sentence under Louisiana law. Following the trial, the town of Slaughter struggled to come to terms with the tragedy. Neighbors who once admired the Fletchers were left grappling with how such horrific neglect could have happened unnoticed in their community. Some expressed guilt for not checking in on Lacy, while others were simply stunned that a family they thought they knew could harbor such a dark secret. The case of Lacey Fletcher became a symbol of extreme neglect and the failure of both familial and societal systems to protect vulnerable individuals. While the legal chapter had closed, the emotional scars remained, leaving a small town forever changed by the silent suffering of one of its own. Do you think the parents are guilty in this case and deserve life imprisonment? Share your opinion in the comments. Also, rate this video with a like and subscribe to the channel by turning on the bell to not miss new videos. Now you can watch the last video about a horrible case when a girl was trapped in her own home. See you soon.